Hello, I'm Ronnie Eldridge. Welcome to Eldridge and Company. Suki Ports is an aristocrat of our city. She's been warning and educating about HIV/AIDS since I can remember, and she does not stop. You are a true activist. I know we don't like that word, but I mean, your work has been astonishing. You've been an outspoken spokesperson since 1989, right? Or before, I guess.
85.
85. And it was in 1989 that you founded
The Family Health Project.
How did you started, I think, I've read or I've heard, you must have always been brought up or believed in community.
Well, it really goes back to probably World War II.
Yeah.
That my mother was under house arrest. The FBI came and checked with the neighbors.
That's because you were
Japanese ancestry.
Were they born in Japan or were they born here?
Well, I should probably go back and tell you. My mother was born in Japan, and her parents, her father had been a painter in Matsui in the castle there in Japan, and he decided that he was going to bring his family to the United States. So he and my grandmother and my mother came to Seattle and settled on Vashon Island at the time when the ferry only went once a month.
A month.
And so my mother grew up in Vashon Island.
Which is near Seattle.
Yes. And then went to the University of Washington, which was very rare in those days for a woman to be going, plus a woman of Japanese ancestry. So she was not a citizen, but she went to the University of Washington. And when she got finished, she wanted to teach. That was really one of the few things that was available for women to do in those days. And so she was told, well, if you want to teach music or you want to do something with music, you really ought to come to New York. So she took the train by herself from Seattle and left her mother and father and came to New York and went to go to teach music, and she had to go to Juilliard and Teachers College. At the same time, my father, who grew up in Hawaii, his parents were sugarcane workers. They came from Japan in the late 1890s, and he decided he wanted to go to school on the mainland, so he was the first kid on the block to leave their street to go to school on the mainland. He went to Oregon. And when he got finished in Oregon, his advisor said, well, if you want to go into business, you really ought to go to Columbia Business School. That's probably the best place for you to go. And so he took the train across country by himself. And it turns out that there was a professor at Columbia who was of Japanese ancestry from Hawaii, who used to invite all of the students over at New Year's, which is a very special time, special Japanese food, and it's sort of the beginning of the new year and whatever. And so he invited all the students, and that's how my mother and father met at Columbia, thousands of miles away from their families. And so my father finished his business education and was a clerk at a little store on Times Square, 42nd Street, up on the 9th floor. And on December 7th, the FBI,
And they got married.
December 7th, the best friend of my sister's father worked for the Daily News at the time, and he called my mother and said, I've just seen something come over the teletype. You better call your husband and tell him to get home immediately. And this was at 12 noon or so on December 7th. So my mother said, he'll never, he works on Sunday. He can't just tell his boss that I'm leaving. And he said, no, you better tell them to close the store, shut the door, and both of them go home. And so my mother called and had to tell my father that Pearl Harbor had been bombed, which of course he wondered what happened to his family. He had no idea because his family was all there in Honolulu. And so that's how we found about World War II. And the FBI came very soon after and checked with all the neighbors and asked some questions like, did my parents speak Japanese to my sister and me, which made quite a difference because I don't speak Japanese well. My mother says I, speak like an American. But after the FBI question, they said there was to be no Japanese in the household. But
They told you couldn't speak Japanese in your own house?
Well, my parents, carried it to the
Yeah.
extreme because nobody knew,
They were scared.
Yeah. And one of the other things was, did my parents draw the shades down and did they play a shortwave radio? And did they, these really sort of, it's almost like a silly spy movie. But so at that point, my mother took down all the curtains. We grew up with no curtains, no shades, nothing on the windows. And
so everybody could see.
well, we dressed in the bathroom. Everybody took turns getting dressed in the bathroom, and that was one of the things. But I think perhaps the saddest part of this is that when my sister and I were old enough to go to summer camp, everybody sent their kids away to summer sleepaway camp.
Yeah.
And the Quakers were very good to the Japanese during World War II. And so the Quakers allowed my sister, and we went to the camp with the neighbor kids in Pennsylvania. And on Parents Visiting Day, everybody else's parents came, and our parents didn't come. So we ran into the woods. My sister and I sat there and cried about how our parents didn't love us the way, and we called them the regular American parents. Loved their kids. And when it was dark, we got scared, so we ran back to camp, and we pretended, we'd been out for the day with our parents. Now, kids nowadays would be on their cell phone saying, where are you? Don't you know it's, well, in those days, you accepted whatever your parents did. They did it for whatever reason, and you didn't ask them. So we never asked them. We never talked about it. We never discussed it. So when it was time for my kids to go to summer camp, my mother was a widow by that time, and I fixed dinner for her every night. She always ate her dinner meal with us. And I said, you're going to have to fix your own dinner this weekend because we're going to go visit our children at summer camp. Now, don't ask me decades later where this came from, but I said,
from your heart.
Exactly. And I said, we're going to go visit the children at summer camp. We think it's important for parents to visit, blah, blah, blah. So my mother burst into tears. And it was the first time I had ever seen her cry, because you just don't show your children that you cry. And she said, we would have come, but the FBI wouldn't let me leave Manhattan. Now, we grew up hearing my mother calling, and my sister and I used to say, we didn't say the wimp, but whatever is the equivalent of a wimp. And why doesn't she just go? Why does she keep calling Daddy? Can she go here? Can she go there? Well, it wasn't our father. It was the FBI.
Oh, isn't that
she was calling. And so it was that many years later that then my mother explained to me about the FBI and what had happened during World War II. So, of course, I ran to my sister and I called her and I said, hey, they did love us, they would have come, the FBI. She said, what are you babbling about? And then I told her all of the same World War II stories.
They didn't get interned in a camp.
No. So that because the neighbors said that they, we didn't seem to do this or that, or all the things that they asked about, and because my father had served in the ROTC in Oregon, that he had a military record. And so between that and the fact that he was born in Hawaii, they did not send them across country to a camp. In the beginning of World War II, they took up most of the Japanese ancestry and put them in Ellis Island.
On the East Coast.
On the East Coast. And then they sent the Japanese-born businessmen. They were all sent back. All of the businesses were closed, and all of the Japanese men were sent back to Japan. So my father all of a sudden got a business. He was all of a sudden a clerk with a store with no customers, because most of the customers went back to Japan. And it was very interesting that's probably where we learned some of my sister and our activism, or advocacy, because just after the war broke out, this salesman he and my father used to go out for a pretty liquid lunch, and he was waiting for my father to go out, and a salesman came in and said, I don't do business with Japs. Give me all my merchandise that you haven't sold and my money. And he took the merchandise and left. And this salesman, and it happens he was from Eastman Kodak, said, why didn't you tell him you aren't a Jap? And my father said, in his eyes, I am a Jap. Doesn't matter what I would have told him. So this salesman said, I will always, don't you worry, I will always provide you with film. Now that ended up being an extremely important issue because film became a very high commodity during the war. And it eventually turned out that this same salesman came back to get film from my father, which was, it was an interesting, and that was when my father told us that we had an obligation, and my mother said we must do something with our education because my sister and I both went to college. It's interesting, they both went to large co-ed universities. They insisted that we go to a small all-girls school, which I find very interesting. But
so you became.
So that's how
your social conscience developed
because of these.
So you got. I mean, I first got involved in community stuff by a playground. You got involved in a school, right?
Well, in school and getting an integrated school in the neighborhood, because when we first looked at the school that our children should have gone to, it was the same school I had gone to, and there were 500 of us in that building. And when I went to go look at the school, it was 2,100 kids on double session.
Now I want to talk about AIDS because this was a fascinating story, but you then founded this family health project. And your whole life your recent life has been committed to that and to people of color and other ethnic, is it ethnic? Is that the proper way?
Yeah.
Backgrounds. And all of this came from your parents and their experience during the war.
Well, I think the other part was that my husband died when the children were very young of melanoma. And I saw him get extremely good health care. And I watched him with the disease progress and the kinds of research and what was involved in his health care. And then when I first got involved in AIDS, I found the kinds of care that people were getting were two kinds of care.
How did you even get involved in AIDS?
A group called the Community Resource Exchange, Fran Barrett and I had a little conference program up at Wave Hill, a garden up in the Bronx. And during the time, it was when people were getting cutbacks from Reagan, and we were helping groups look at various kinds of ways to get over this problem. And one of the groups to have a conference was the New York City Council of Churches. And they said, we're having a terrible time with our chaplains in the prison system and our chaplains in various hospitals because they're having a hard time getting a straight story about what is wrong with the people. And so the Council of Churches had the first conference on AIDS as it affects minorities ever. This was on the...
Up until then, AIDS was basically a white homosexual.
Well, it was considered that. But from day one...
ACT UP. But from day one...
Day one, there were women, there were people of color. I mean, you know, if anybody gave it any thought to think that there wouldn't be gay men of color, if there are white men of color, there are obviously gay men of color who would be affected. But there are also women because there were drug users, and drug users sharing needles with women, or women sharing needles with other women, or whatever. From day one, there were cases of people of color.
Let's now jump to the present situation with AIDS. It's terrible.
I can't think of a more destructive... you know, Ronnie, before AIDS came along, we didn't do very well to give children of color living especially in urban areas or the rural poverty areas, we didn't give them a good education.
Right.
The Brown v. Board of Ed didn't do it for a lot of children in this country. And so children didn't get an education. Not getting an education, you don't get the job, you don't get the health care, you don't get the house. So we had a whole level of people, mainly of color and poor, in this country before AIDS came along. So then when AIDS came along, on top of that, we expected somehow people with AIDS to respond in the same way, or we expected people who were taking care of people with AIDS to respond in the same way for all people. And we also expected people who were poor, who had not had an education, to understand about prevention. didn't happen.
Is most of your work with prevention, trying to
Well,
educate?
it's primarily with prevention, but there's also a major issue with doctors who were in the med schools and in the professors at med schools and students were for a long time privileged white, with a few people of color who made it into med school. The issues of culture and traditions of people of color were not understood by the white professors, or the need to have people understand that, let alone the other white doctors. So when this disease came along that was primarily gay and primarily people of color, but especially low-income people of color who, for example, drug users, a lot of doctors didn't take care of drug users because they didn't have to. But when AIDS came along and drug users were in the public hospitals, the private, wealthy kids that got into trouble with drugs had doctors who took care of them, but the majority of the poor did not. And so they not only did not have good health care before AIDS, but when AIDS came along, a lot of people died of an overdose, and it was not looked into until about 5 years into the epidemic that people said, wait a minute, there are an awful lot of people dying, they're drug users, there must be something. And as a matter of fact, the first person to write about this, when we did the conference in November of 1985, there were 2 pieces of literature that I could find in the various media. And you compare that now, you could find stacks. But there were 2 articles, one by Larry Altman from the New York Times, who was linking the possibility of the green monkey in Africa to the simian version of HIV was SIV, and linking the possibility of that being somehow one of the sources of HIV. That was one article, and the other was Wayne Barrett in the Village Voice writing an article on drug users and the people who were drug users who had AIDS. Those were the only 2 things we had to look at.
So you really helped develop the public consciousness, awareness, and even the history.
Oh, there were a lot of people, but I think the uniqueness was that there weren't too many little old Japanese ancestry women shaking their fist at somebody at the CDC.
Who has no fear.
Well, you figure if I could get arrested sitting in front of a bulldozer to keep Columbia from building their gym, I could
anything
deal
you don't
with
know, right? So you've
CDC.
got a report here because it's about women
Yes.
in AIDS, and reading it, it's astonishing at the percentage of women in the state who are HIV or AIDS infected, right? It's 30% of the.
Well, it's now of the total cases, women are close to 30. But the issue that's really quite telling is the fact that, and the numbers, I don't, but if you look at the city of New York as a whole, there were 34,505 women with AIDS, cumulative cases. In the state, there were 41,534. So New York City bears the major responsibility
over 75%.
of the people with AIDS in New York State. But of the New York City women, 44.6% were black, 31.5 were Hispanic, 0.8 were Asian and Pacific Islander and Native American. Now, African Americans are only 22.8%. So when you look at the percentage of black in the state and the city, the most would be 25% of the total population. And if they have 44% of the cases. So between the women who
were either drug users
or now growing numbers of men who have sex with women, it's a growing number compared to earlier when there were more gay men than heterosexual infections. But there's been a whole issue of the down low. It's been it was an article in the New York Times Magazine that made it kind of a popular thing to think about, which was really very unfair to black men. Because every single society has a mother who wants her child to get married so she has a grandchild.
Right.
And it's common with every single, it's Asian, it's Native American, it's Hispanic, it's whatever. And there are men who listen to mama and get married and have children, have a good job. For all the societal impression, this is a straight man with the typical family. When in fact he has a boyfriend on the side somewhere because he truly is a gay man, but he really is responding. 20, 30, 40 years ago, you didn't have the acceptance of homosexuality as there is now, although there's still a lot of stigma for a lot of people. But
they also could have been drug abusers and been infected themselves that way.
They could have, but
right. In Africa, it's mostly from transmission from men, right? And
well, in most cases, women get it from men. It's very efficient for men to give it to women. Women rarely give it to men. So the issue is the responsibility or the irresponsibility of men. And then as soon as you say something like that, it's, you don't like men.
So is there more attention now being paid to the growing population of women who are HIV and AIDS infected?
Finally, and that's a report like this. This is the date of this is December 2005. We're now into 25 years of the epidemic, and this is the first report. To the credit of New York State, they are the first state to do one quite as comprehensive as this, and the first group, the New York State AIDS Advisory Council, it's the first group to develop this report. But it's still,
lacking. Does the Advisory Council take a position on the mandatory testing of women when they become pregnant?
Yes, they did. There are several doctors on the panel. There are several. I must say, one of the things that I find a little distressing is that the majority of the panel are white, and the majority, if you took the mean age, it's probably 103. No,
but that's the usual story.
It's
older.
It's
but
older
what is
people.
the position on mandatory testing?
Well,
there's now again a
the
resurgence
testing,
of the effort in Albany.
There was a decision by the State Department of Health as well as New York City to have the mandatory testing of women.
Right.
It's actually the testing of babies, which then told you how infected the women were. But this was an extremely, some of us know that this was, all the conspiracy theories that get poo-pooed, but this was sort of a sop to the fact that there were people in the legislature and people in this country who wanted all gay men tested. Then they wanted all men tested. It was very controversial, and then people said, "Well, test the women." Then it was too impractical to test everybody, so let's just test the babies. Then we can tell the number of women, and then also that they were infected.
But there's been a great advance in being able to take a woman who's HIV infected and protect the baby.
Yes, and so now
now we're into a different
into a different era. It has been amazing how the various drugs have helped to prevent the birth of babies.
Do we think we should test pregnant women? It's a very difficult issue, isn't it?
It's a very difficult issue, but I think there's nothing wrong in testing. It's how we tell people, how we help them, how we counsel people. I think it's very important because it certainly has cut down almost entirely the number of babies born.
But this is what you think is so important, is that it's culturally appropriate and that we do this kind of education and outreach to people in that way.
I have to show you. I don't know if this will show up on the.
We have 2 minutes to this program.
This is how many. This is AIDS written in quite a few languages, and we don't have that many people trained to talk in all the different languages. So if you're going to test somebody, that's fine. We should know so that they can be counseled not to infect their partners or.
Right. But they should be.
But it should be in a language they understand, or that they understand the results of it, and there should be services there. There's nothing wrong with testing, but people have to understand what they're being tested for, and they have to really...
and then once the verdict is in, what can they do?
What can they do? I mean, you don't even have to speak a language to have a doctor or a nurse come in with a very serious face. I mean, you know something's wrong.
Right.
So it's we have a lot of work to do.
Do you think we're making headway?
Slowly, but I think there's still a great gap in people respecting other people's culture and the need to...
But we can relate it. It's interesting to the whole question of immigrants, can't we?
Oh, absolutely. But then they have the added worry about the immigration service, and so they're going to really be at a loss unless they give test anonymously. And that's what we advise anybody who is not sure of their immigration status or not sure of their HIV
status. The crowds of people that we see are such a total evidence of the need to be culturally responsive, because we have so many different kinds of people living in this country. In this country and in this city especially. Yeah. We really... And you must be very pleased to see so many different kinds of people. Oh, absolutely. Yeah. It's wonderful. But, we really have to recognize that we're not a melting pot. It's not all going to be some homogeneous... Right. We are very different, and we have to respect that. Right. Well, you are certainly a fine example of a citizen who's overdone her responsibility. Well, thank you. And a great hope for a lot of people. Thank you. Thank you for hearing about it. Thank you. If there are any people you'd like to hear and topics you'd like us to explore, please let me know. You can write to me at CUNY TV, 365 Fifth Avenue, New York, New York, 10016, or you can go to the website at cuny.tv and click on Contact Us. I look forward to hearing from you.